Yesterday, Premier Christy Clark was in Ottawa to take part in meetings with her federal counterparts. Topics of note were the ongoing opioid crisis and the softwood lumber dispute with the U.S., of which British Columbia is their largest supplier. Presently, the two countries are without a deal as the previous softwood lumber agreement expired in October, and the U.S. has indicated it will allow unfettered access for BC lumber for the next year. But after that, we can't be certain what a fairly new and protectionist American first government under the Trump administration will really mean for this crucial industry in BC. Clark, showing why she is such an effective leader and public speaker, outlined why she doesn't think President-elect Trump and his new administration will want to risk a prolonged dispute with Canada over softwood lumber. With the U.S. housing market finally starting to show signs of life again after the massive downturn in and around the financial crisis of 2008, Premier Clark suggested that Trump won't want to slow down any of that construction, especially if other parts of the economy begin to pick up and housing construction follows. Here's what she said while she was meeting with reporters yesterday in Ottawa. Quote, "The thing about Donald Trump is that he has talked to Americans about jobs and affordability. One of the things we also know is that if Canadian softwood doesn't come into the United States, the price of housing goes way through the roof." And while that is all speculative at this point, it's kind of why Christy Clark is such an effective campaigner and speaker. She speaks with such conviction and belief in what she says, and that has worked well in convincing British Columbians. But this dispute runs deeper than the simple economics of supply and demand and even the geographic considerations like how BC is very close to the new construction markets in California, Arizona, and Nevada. Those are all positive factors for BC softwood lumber. But the America's largest bone of contention is to do with Canadian stumpage, or the cost the forestry companies pay our governments as a royalty. The Americans believe we are unfairly subsidizing our forestry companies through a somewhat complicated stumpage formula. I won't bore you with the details of that right now, but a few days ago I managed to speak with BC Forestry Minister Steve Thompson about some of these issues with the U.S., and also the fact BC forestry revenues are down in recent years. And what are some of the keys to getting those revenues up again? Take a look.
We're looking to engage. We have been engaging all along in the process with the Americans. Obviously, a critical issue for our industry to provide that certainty with a managed trade agreement. We would like free trade, but if you look back over the history, it's always been a managed trade process. We've either had managed trade or litigation. We prefer managed trade. So we are actively engaged both with our industry and 55% of BC is 55% of Canadian softwood lumber production, so very critical for us. We've engaged with our industry. We're engaged with provincial colleagues across the country. We're engaged with Canada, as Canada is the lead on this through Global Affairs, and there are ongoing engagement, discussions, work to try to find our way through to a managed trade agreement, and we still feel there's a window of opportunity to do it, and we're putting lots of effort, but it's very fair to say that has been challenging. It's difficult in many cases to have when you don't have a dance partner that is providing substantive responses to many of the sort of proposals and work we're putting forward, but we're working flat out to continue to try to achieve a managed trade agreement even in this time frame.
It seems that revenues are down in forestry, sadly. What is something that the province is doing to maximize our revenues from this resource? Is something would you consider something in doing more of these other managed forest areas where they're not necessarily on Crown land, that we allow private landholders to do their own forestry, like sort of like what the Irvines do out in New Brunswick? I know they do it very well out there.
Sure. We first of all, revenues generally in forestry are on the increase and have been over the last few years. After we've come through 2008, 2009, they're below longer-term historical revenue levels, but we've worked very hard to make sure that we have a competitive industry here in British Columbia. We just released a competitiveness strategy, 50 recommendations in it to keep that globally competitive industry, and parts of that strategy are increasing opportunities around management on forested lands, Crown land. So community forests, when we came in 2001, we had one community forest in the province. We now have 55 forests that are managed by communities, opportunities for First Nations through direct ward tenures, through First Nation woodland licenses. We'd be focusing on providing those opportunities. We have components of private land in British Columbia through the private managed forest land process. So we have a variety of tenures. That's important to have that diversity, and that's part of our strategy.
Last question. What is it that you think, and I've noticed that this is what the NDP loves to hark on, the raw log exports. What is their deal? Is that are they just trying to defend labor jobs when they talk about that, or is this something that they've just sort of come up with that they believe is a problem and it's wrong? I sort of hear a similar refrain talking about oil exports, that we shouldn't ship raw bitumen, we should upgrade it or refine it. Is that sort of the essence of it, and is it practical? That's what I really want to know.
So what they don't understand is that log exports are a component of the economics of the coastal forestry. This is a coastal industry primarily, and we need a component and a percentage of log exports that has that higher value in order to provide the economic base for harvesting activity on the island. So if we were to do what they talk about doing in terms of and we don't really, they don't have a clear policy on it, because sometimes they say you should ban them, sometimes they say you should increase the taxation on them, so you really don't know for sure. But if we did what they were proposing to do, then we would actually cause job loss on the coast. It would reduce harvesting activity, reduce opportunities for contractors, reduce opportunities in communities, reduce opportunities for First Nations, because it's an important component of building those opportunities for First Nations. It's about having the balance, and we recognize that, and we do have that in British Columbia. We have a surplus test that says anything to be exported has to be advertised first before exporting, and if it's needed for the domestic industry, it's made available for the domestic industry.
A couple things to draw from that interview. First, I was a bit disappointed that Minister Thompson wasn't willing to commit more to focusing on what you heard me refer to as other managed forest areas. Essentially, they're private plantations, and they allow for more complete silviculture and faster production. But on the other hand, I thought his counter to what the NDP opposes in raw log exports was great, and I hope we continue to recognize that that is a part of our industry here in BC. For the Rebel.media, I'm Christopher Wilson. Thanks for watching. Keep it locked on our YouTube channel for any updates on the softwood lumber dispute and how it affects British Columbia.